Well, Red Wings and Canadiens fans, we have really similar stories today for both of these teams and both of these prospects that happen to be in the KHL and that could be, or not could be, probably would be, heading over to the Habs and Red Wings. So, very similar stories for both of these guys, very similar circumstances. Let's dive into it here, starting out with the Montreal Canadiens. Let's talk about a tweet posted by Marco D'Amico, because earlier yesterday, he ended up having this post, which got a lot of folks excited for what the future has in store. Montreal Canadiens prospect Bogdan Konyushkov is coming to Montreal for development camp. The Habs prospect spoke about his run to a VHL championship, his impression of Montreal, and his relationship with Ivan Demidov. Full interview below. Daria Tuboltseva is the writer of the article that RG.org published that talks about Bogdan Konyushkov, a Habs prospect that a lot of folks have been kind of throwing under the radar a little bit, mostly because he doesn't have a super high profile or a super flashy skill set. But before we dive into the article that is written about here and some of the quotes about this guy, we gotta go over some of the numbers, because Bogdan Konyushkov has given Canadiens fans a good enough reason to dive into him and his profile. He's a right-handed D-man, 6 feet, 172, 22 years old, drafted by the Habs in the 4th round of the 2023 NHL Entry Draft, and this season playing for Torpedo. He ended up having 17 points in 67 games played. Now, that's not amazing, but when you consider the fact that in the VHL he was sub-point per game, and in 23-24 he was the captain of Torpedo, scoring 28 points in 65 games over there, you can definitely see that there is some, how do I describe it? There's some fishy KHL deployment stuff going on here, but ultimately, for Bogdan Konyushkov, he was a guy that, especially last year, displayed a lot of potential as a puck-moving defenseman, a guy who can stabilize that back end, and who was one of the more relied upon players as the captain of Torpedo in 23-24. Now, we're heading over onto the summer of 2025 after a season that was a statistical decline, and Konyushkov has finally gotten the go-ahead to come over to Montreal. This article that was talked about on RG.org goes over a whole bunch of Bogdan Konyushkov's opinions about stuff. It talks about the Montreal Canadiens. It talks about Ivan Demidov. Let's go out there and read some of these quotes here, courtesy of Daria Tuboltseva. But Bogdan Konyushkov ends up going out there and saying that he's already received his visa and he will fly to Canada this summer. He couldn't go last summer because he didn't have a passport. Now that he has one, he immediately applied for a visa and was able to get the go-ahead. He ended up talking about Ivan Demidov, and he says here, "I wasn't surprised that Ivan went over to Montreal in the spring. We discussed this possibility when we played together for the national team, so it wasn't a surprise for me. I was happy when he scored in his very first NHL game. My entire feed was buzzing about him. Montreal was ecstatic, and Twitter was ecstatic. I think he'll become even more popular with the fans next season. He'll spend the summer there, getting to know the city and the culture. Those playoff games probably showed him just how hockey crazy the city is." The article then says this, that the day that Demidov scored, right before Konyushkov's game against Chalmette, they showed us his goal about 5 times. We weren't watching the goal itself, but how Demidov moved around the ice. But I still felt happy for him, even after watching it 5 times. So now, as we wait to see Bogdan Konyushkov head over to Montreal and suit up for the Canadiens in development camp, we just gotta wait and see what this young prospect is capable of bringing, and whether or not he'll translate in the same way that Ivan Demidov did. Now, let's shift gears over from one Kov to another Kov, because we're talking not just about Konyushkov, but also about Buchelnikov. Here's a tweet posted by Hockey News Hub that goes over a Detroit Red Wings prospect that we gotta dive into here. Per Artur Kyrulin, Red Wings prospect Dmitri Buchelnikov may leave for Detroit if Vitesse Moscow is removed from the KHL. In that case, the player will become an unrestricted free agent in the KHL. Now, okay, I said at the beginning of the video, like, oh, similar situations, eh? Nah, this is really not the same situation. It's not the same kind of thing. But Dmitri Buchelnikov is a guy that, as a Red Wings prospect who was drafted in the second round of 2022, he's 21 years old and he's a right-handed left-wing player. He scored himself 54 points in 65 games this previous season, 15 goals, 39 assists. He was really productive as a second-year full-time KHL player. He exploded in terms of his offensive capabilities, and he was the top-scoring guy on Vitesse Moscow in the KHL. He was a beast. Unfortunately for him, though, Vitesse Moscow was second last in their conference. They were not really a good team, and ultimately, with the news that they might be removed from the KHL, it puts Buchelnikov in a very difficult spot. And now, if the only other option, if they do get removed from the KHL, is for Buchelnikov to head over to Detroit, that is a piece of the Red Wings' future that I don't think none of us really expected to see suit up anywhere in Detroit or in Michigan this early. Okay, like he'll go over to Grand Rapids or something, he'll play there, he might get a call-up once in a while, that's fine. But like, the fact that it's happening now, he's only 21 years old, he had just only played 2 seasons in the KHL, I mean, that's so different from the old run-of-the-mill second-round pick that ends up making some sort of an impact later after he gets drafted, that I think that it's interesting here that it could be a KHL team's demise that ultimately starts this whole process for Buchelnikov and the Detroit Red Wings. We've made a few videos over the past year or so just talking about Buchelnikov and the potential that he had displayed, because not only was he productive in the KHL this previous season, but he also was doing some good things in the VHL, and he was so dominant in the MHL as far back as 2 years ago. There was always a lot to talk about with Dmitri Buchelnikov, a guy who could potentially exhibit maybe a middle-to-top 6 caliber skill set offensively at the NHL level. But now, seems like we might be able to see that in Detroit sooner rather than later. That is, of course, assuming Vitesse Moscow region gets removed from the KHL, and if he inevitably decides, yeah, no, I want to leave. I want to play in North America now. There's no reason to stay here anymore. So if you're a fan of the Montreal Canadiens and a fan of Bogdan Konyushkov for Torpedo, or if you're a fan of the Red Wings and Dmitri Buchelnikov and Vitesse Moscow region, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about each of these guys and how they had played this previous year. Some of them had declined in point production, others took a bigger responsibility. Some of them are looking towards potentially making an impact sooner, but both of them seem to be heading over to North America in some capacity. Unless, of course, if you wanted to say that Buchelnikov is not guaranteed. Yeah, he's not guaranteed yet, but depending on the tides that be and the KHL decision-makers on which teams are available to play again next year, we might have our answer soon, now won't we? This is pretty good for the Red Wings and the Canadiens, but I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sign on, and bye.